So much for being with us in Morning at NTV, Priscilla, Regina, Naloga. Now, here is how queer life is. One is asked, where do you stay? And you say Entebbe Road, and one quickly judges you for being a supporter of FDC. Now, that is how politics has been divided to the extent. Now, how much more for the young person who doesn't truly understand the foundations of politics and democracy? This morning in Tech Note, we're going to be looking at fostering the potential of African youths to development. And that, of course, includes patriotism. Young people are at the very heart of Africa's development agenda, with over 75% of Africa's 1.2 billion inhabitants under the age of 35 and 453 million Africans aged between 15 and 35. It goes without saying that the development outcomes of Africa's young people have a significant and yet lasting effect on the continent's trajectory. The challenges Africa faces in education, in employment, in health, in governance, and most accurately felt by Africa's young people. Now, the African Union Commission, along with the rest of the world, recognizes the centrality of youth in achieving the aspirations of the Agenda 2063. And Aspiration 6 in particular envisions a continent with people-driven development, relying especially on its youth. So what initiatives can be taken to pragmatically act on Pan-Africanism and also help the young people take on this new mission on the African continent? Well, without further ado, allow me to introduce my guests that are going to be breaking down these conversations for us. Jacob Eyeru, who's the Chairperson, National Youth Council. You're most welcome.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back on NTV.
Right. And of course, we do have a new suspect on this conversation, Harris Akampurira, youth leader and also speaker representing Kawempe division, to expand on this conversation. You're most welcome, Harris.
Thank you, Priscilla, for having me.
Yes.
Good morning to our viewers.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Chairman. Tell us about the African Youth Month that we are looking at, the significance of it in the Pan-African conversation, spreading it to the young people across Africa, but more so Uganda in particular.
Thank you. First of all, you've put the statistics well for all to see. This is a young continent, and the majority of our people, of our human capital, are young people. 75% below 35 is not the biggest statistic. The biggest statistic is that it is growing younger. In the next 10 years, it will be about 83% below 35. So it means that even of the composition of that 75%, the bigger percentage of about 50% are below the age of 18. So the continent is generally growing younger, and in recognizing that population composition, the African Union, along with the heads of state, were able to recognize that there is need to focus on that generation and be able to build us as a whole continent, focusing on the capacity of the numbers. So the African Youth Month is a call towards every actor in the continent and every person to recognize the special place that young people should adopt and should be at within the context of a continent, but to also call on young people to recognize their responsibility towards this continent because of their overwhelming number. You cannot be a sideshow when in fact you are the biggest issue on the plate, you are the biggest space taker. So that really is the idea behind it. It takes on very many themes, but all the themes are in what you basically highlighted. What is the place of Africa's future in terms of the development indicators? And there are very many languages in which development indications come. The language of SDGs, the language of Millennium Development, the language of regional visions, but the most important one, the consensus language on the continent, is Agenda 2063. Where will Africa be? And Agenda 2063 cannot be better said as a responsibility of the youth than the numbers already show. If you look at for example, presidents on the continent, the average age of presidents being about 58 years of age, you will notice that in 2063 they will not be there. They will simply by nature not be there. So the people who will be there, by what actions will they be driven? By what visions will they be driven? For how long would they have understood that agenda? This is why the African Youth Month is important.
Okay, all right. In respect of that submission, I'll turn to you, Harris. You have the privilege of having a sample space that has a lot of young people, Kawempe division referring to. And I want to find out from you, what have been the challenges of you engaging with these youth, access to the basics that could help bring to life the vision 2063, for example, in the sector of health, education, employment.
Thank you very much. In this conversation, it is very much important that we put it in the context. And Kawempe division, which I represent as their speaker, is a microcosm of the realities of the African child. And what is the structure of a Kawempe youth like? Uneducated, out of employment, not in training, not anywhere. Over 80% of Kawempe division is a slum, and that's a reality across the Ugandan nation, and that's a reality across the African continent, meaning that this 75% of the African population we are talking about, 90% of it lives in slum conditions. And slum conditions are poor or no education at all, poor health outcomes, poor hygiene, poor access, all the social economic factors. So while we talk about removing barriers to, as it is the theme for this Africa Youth Month, to meaningful youth participation, then we must actually look at the reality of the young person in Africa. And the reality, as I've described it, is that of lack of access. And the minority that, usually speak on these platforms, on many forums, they're not actually the young people that actually reflect these realities on the ground.
Okay.
Yeah, so what then do we need to do? What we need to do...
As you give us what needs to be done, I just need to draw understanding. When you say lack of access, is it lack of access? They cannot get to where the services are or the things they need, or is it that those services and elements are actually absent?
The problem is that structurally, they are excluded from participation. They're excluded from economic participation, from political participation, because of structural barriers. So for them to begin, for us to even begin talking about meaningful participation, then we must look at those structural barriers and have a genuine conversation on how to remove them out of the way for them to participate.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so you were still saying?
Yes, so then how do we now get the young people get involved? We need to take a structural analysis, and I want to start with politically. My brother Eyeru Jacob heads the National Youth Council, but this is captured. Ordinarily, this would be a platform for meaningful participation. The young people in Uganda and the young people in Africa are the majority, but with a minority mindset. So platforms like UNSA, that is Uganda National Students Association, National Youth Council, and many others are supposed to be genuine platforms for genuine engagement, to push the regime, to push the powers that are at play, to make sure that they actually engender policies, that they actually engender programs, initiatives that promote active and meaningful involvement of the young people. But the dilemma of the African child, of African youth, is that these political platforms for meaningful participation have been captured by the political elite, whose main agenda is longevity and self-preservation.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Harris. Now turning back to you, Jacob, in regards to what he has mentioned, participation, and he's saying there's no participation. I would like to young people have a tendency of going to the extreme, you know, when extending their plights and what they go through. Political participation, for example, the age limit having been lifted gave the opportunity to young people to be then politically able to participate and be included in the conversation of politics. And I think that should be a mark that should be given a tick. So instead of taking it you know, as abstract, why not pick out certain elements that are presently able for you to participate in and actively participate in them, and then that can be realized by society to include you in other things?
Priscilla, there is a marked distinction between form and substance. And as I've already alluded, in terms of space for participation, there is that space. There is a wide structure. In fact, as looking at statistics, Uganda has the most elected leaders in terms of elected leaders to population ratio. We have the highest in the whole world. So there's space for them to participate, but that does not translate into meaningful participation. Why do I say that? In Uganda, power is highly concentrated. So meaning that even when these platforms like National Youth Council, like UNSA exist, they cannot actually engage powers meaningfully. They actually are forced into predicting and trying to learn what the powers that be are interested in.
And Jacob is smiling to this regard. And as you give us response to what Harris has said, you also, I would like to also pick your mind in recently the initiation of idea of mindset change, basically patriotism and Pan-Africanism, and what your perspective is on that.
Thank you. Just like you said, I need to respond a bit. My comrade Harris here should know that meaningful participation does not mean opposition. And so I heard him use words like captured, the youth structures are captured, and they are not meaningfully engaging. First of all, just in case you may not know, the National Youth Council is constituted politically. So people have political affiliations and they run for elective office. And none of the people who is electing is by law permitted to be above the age of 30. So maybe the numbers in the National Youth Council should also show the political reality, and indeed they do. They are consistent with the president's elective results. They are consistent with parliamentary party dominations. They are consistent with local government. In fact, they are not as bad and as clearly bad for the opposition as in local government, where my brother Harris is part. So it is just a reality, what you see in the country, that the majority of the people on the NRM is the reason why the National Youth Council has a majority of the NRM. It is not, and for me it is good that the leadership of the National Youth Council reflects the leadership of the country. It shows the consistency of the democracy of the country. To the question of Pan-Africanism, I think that Uganda is a very lucky country, and young people in Uganda are in a very lucky state. I don't think there is a president or a head of state on the continent now that is as vocal, as hands-on about Pan-Africanism, patriotism than the head of state of our country. And I think it is our responsibility to notice that and take it up and learn from it and run with it. But it is not a question of simply saying who is the head of state of a particular country and how much are they committed. It's a question of young people recognizing and learning from the few who are speaking about it and saying your prosperity depends on your unity. And I want to thank Comrade Harris for saying, for bringing out the theme. The issue in Africa is an issue of barriers. Young Africans, all Africans are just barring each other. Africa's trade capacity internally that you have something you're selling in Uganda and you want to sell it in Ethiopia, is much more harder than if you want to sell it outside of Africa. And that is the problem, where you have a competitive advantage in terms of cost.
You do have businesses, small media businesses, but they're not getting the privilege of leniency from, you know, the responsible authorities and bodies, which yet is given to, you know, those that are foreign in this country.
Yes, so in terms of how do we take a competitive edge as Africans? Actually, it's a race question. As black people, how are you advantaging yourself in the international scheme of things? If you do not respond to your structural challenges, the cost of an air ticket in Europe from country to country in some places is as low as $100. In Africa, flying from any border point to another border point, you're north of $400.
Between you and me, you know that will call for investment in aviation, which investment is per the priorities of any nation given on African continent.
Yes, but you see, what we're saying is young people in Africa need to be able to take up conversation at that level, not at the level of Pan-Africanism is a historical subject. It should be at the level of Pan-Africanism today is a socio-economic question. How are we uniting for the future? And that has always been the principle of Pan-Africanism, not to look at the status of what has happened before, but of the need that is presenting itself in the future.
Okay.
And that's where we're going.
Speaking of presenting the future to ourselves as young people, and I'll turn to you, Harris. As far as Africa is concerned, I know that there's some initiatives like the Green Free Trade that have come up, and all these other different initiatives. The purpose of them is to actually build opportunity for the youth and build a youth with a purpose for the future to attain the 2063 plan. So in boosting African development, taking it back to your sample space in Kawempe, how are you then advocating youth to take responsibility of such opportunities available?
Yeah, but before I respond to that, Priscilla, I think that Jacob mentioned something that should not go unresponded to when he says that President Museveni has been at the forefront of Pan-Africanism. I think that it's only fair for us to talk about Pan-Africanism in a context where the leader respects the African people. But if you don't respect the African person, you don't respect their human rights, you don't respect their plight, you discriminate against them, then I think such a leader has no right to talk about Pan-Africanism, unless they are using it as a veneer, as a cover to, you know, defend their government, and that's all. Yeah, but coming to your question, Priscilla, about green growth, and you know, recently the African countries agreed on the Africa Free Continental Trade Area, and basically this is to say let's remove barriers to trade. And research actually indicates that the African Continental Trade Area is going to enhance trade in Africa by 50%. And coupled to that, now the Western world is saying there are, you know, climate imperatives, not just trade, but this trade must be climate compliant. Now that means two things. Number one, on one end is that Uganda and young people must have the requisite capacity for them to participate. Otherwise, if there are no competencies, if there are no enterprises, if there are no businesses, if there are no industries, then what are you going to trade in? If there are no value addition and value chain improvement opportunities for the young people in Kawempe, what are they going to trade in? So when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade Area, we need to be particular to who exactly we are referring to, who are likely to benefit in the next 30 years if the current structure is not disrupted. If the current structure is maintained, the person who is going to benefit are the multilateral corporations who dominate the production and industrial growth in this country. So that takes me back to my earlier point that 80%, 90% of the young Africans stays in the ghetto under dire conditions. So they even don't have entry points into what we are talking about. So at some point, this kind of sounds elitist. And I've listened to Professor Soma, who is one of the professors that has studied this problem in Africa at the University of Boston. He has said that there is clearly a separation between the political elite and then the population. And what the political elite are talking about in most of the times is clearly cut from the reality. So while we talk about, African free continental trade area, it's a good concept, but that alone is not enough. It must be backed by systematic and strategic level policies and initiatives to get these young people a lot of potential. Let me conclude with these statistics by United Nations. It was released in their report in 2018, and they said that Uganda has over 15 million people between the age of 15 and 24. These ordinarily are supposed to be in school, but they are not in school, they are not in employment, they are not in any form of gainful endeavors that they are partaking in. So until we begin to discuss in an honest conversation how we can engage these 15 million people, and a bunch of them are in Kawempe, the people that I talk to, most of them are in garages, most of them are just there playing Ludo, they are playing cards, they are in betting, they want opportunity. This is a lost potential. You can imagine if, as a government, we gave each and every one of these 15 million young people an opportunity to even earn 10,000 shillings per day, how much that would be contributed to the GDP, and how in turn that would, reflect on our health sector, our roads, and many other social amenities that are in their need for financing.
Thank you so much, Harris. He did make mention of, if we're going to stay with the current structure, then, and there's no call for reforms in that structure to then achieve and benefit from these trade-free zones and all these wonderful initiatives being created across Africa, then we are not really targeting the young people in benefiting from these initiatives.
Thank you. Let me start here. I think I like Comrade Harris. He has a heart for the people of Kawempe. But I want to remind him it's not a campaigning platform for the people of Kawempe, because it's appearing to me that he's being a bit disingenuous. And I'm going to start from there.
From the beginning, I said it's a microcosm.
And I want to help here. Let's start there. He has identified very rightfully that the need in Africa is not the rhetoric. It has to be felt on the ground. And feeling on the ground, if you're talking about industrialization, goes into industrial hubs, which President Museveni is talking about and implementing. Being on the ground is talking about a myoga, giving young people the capacity in their chosen artisans to be able to organize and be able to collaborate together and run their own enterprises. It looks like the parish development model, where you're going into the rural areas, giving people who are in subsistent agriculture the capacity to commercialize their produce. That is being on the ground. It is very convenient for elites, and elites now, I'm looking in this direction.
When you look in that direction, and say elite, what do you mean? Because perhaps there are many who identify or want to identify.
Yes, the elite is the one that maintains that there is a problem because the statistics show. and does not recognize that there is a solution that needs me to be on ground. It would be better if my brother, if my brother's analysis was telling me that the Emyoga program in Kawempe has not benefited any of the youth in that community, because that mobilization is what takes the agenda forward. The agenda at the top is elitist. The paperwork cannot talk about the ghetto youth. That language is not in the paperwork. That language must be met by the policy implementer on the ground. When you're drawing up the beneficiary groups, are you identifying the people from the ghetto? The 80% of Africa that is in rural Africa and in the small centers that are becoming urbanized, how do they interact at the national level? And just to compound the matter, what we are talking about is that young people need to see Africa in that sense. And how we are contributing to that as a National Youth Council is by saying we need to take more young Ugandans and young Africans to that conversation table. That talks about peace and security, that talks about the education question, that talks about youth in business. And such platforms on the continent are like the Youth Lead Summit, the U-Lead Summit in Tanzania, which we will be taking young people to this December, to again discuss these matters on after. And I like that he has brought it up. There is a young man in Uganda called David that leads an independent advisory council for after. The initiative taken there to say, how do young people fit in, is what we are trying to drive as well and be able to work with. So these are the matters that I think young people need to be engaged on a daily, and these are the matters that we commit our efforts to as a National Youth Council. And of course to helping brothers like my elitist brother here, that we need to get on ground. The language is beautiful, the criticism is good, but the work is there and it needs us on ground.
All right, in conclusion, Harris, your parting shots.
Yes, my parting shots is that Uganda is a very youthful country with a lot of talent, incredible talent, and we feel that we represent a new set of ideas, new set of values, aspirations that are clearly out of touch with the older generation who continue to dominate the political and economic space. So I would like to call upon young people, irrespective of your political party, to come together to come up with the national values that are going to bind us for the next 30, 50 years as a country. Those that I would call non-negotiables. That when there are human rights abuses on the streets of Kampala, irrespective of your political party, you will come up and say, this is unacceptable. That if there is corruption, as a young person, you're going to come up, irrespective of your political party, and say, this is a cancer to my country, and I will not allow it.
Okay, the rest of the month has to go on. What's on the agenda, Jacob?
First of all, I agree with him. Young people in this country need to find the consensus building points. Where do we want to see the country in 50 years? And that's our engagement agenda. Whether it's on the question of human rights, what human rights future do we want, we need to support. And I think this is in line with almost all the political frameworks in the country. The question really is at implementation level of some of this, and it needs our voice backing. So yes, we are on board.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. The question falls at implementation level. But at the end of the day, the call comes out to young people to take up responsibility of own self, therefore taking up responsibility of society and making sure that current structures can be revised and reformed so that it can be more inclusive to the young people who are then the next future of Africa. That brings us to the end of this conversation. We're going to be taking a short break. Stay with us.